When people imagine ninjas, they see black armor, perfect assassins, elite warriors trained from birth. None of that is where ninjas came from. The real ninja clans were not born in palaces. They were born in hiding, among farmers, refugees, smugglers, and men who had already lost everything. This is not the story of shadow warriors. This is the story of how desperation created a myth. If you're drawn to the hidden side of history, subscribe to Fragments of History. Leave a like if stories like this deserve to be told, and comment what city you're watching from. The ninja you think you know. Close your eyes and picture a ninja. What do you see? A figure dressed entirely in black, face covered except for the eyes, moving across rooftops under moonlight, scaling walls with impossible ease, throwing shuriken that never miss, vanishing into smoke. This is the ninja everyone recognizes, the ninja of movies and video games, the ninja that sells toys and fills martial arts schools, one of the most exported icons of Japanese culture. But this ninja never existed. The black suit is theater. The rooftop acrobatics are choreography. The smoke is stagecraft. The throwing stars were rarely used and almost never fatal. Most of what people know about ninjas was assembled long after the real ones were gone. The modern myth was sharpened in 20th century cinema. Studios needed villains who looked striking and moved like secrets. They borrowed a visual language from kabuki, stagehands dressed in black to signal invisibility. That costume became the uniform. Hollywood pushed it further. In the 1980s, American action films turned ninjas into superhuman assassins, fighters who could dismantle a room full of men, who trained from childhood in hidden mountain temples, who served shadowy masters and lived by ancient codes. None of this was history, it was fantasy, and fantasy that sells becomes truth. People repeat. Martial arts schools around the world now teach authentic ninja techniques built for cameras. Tourist villages offer training experiences shaped by pop culture, not record. Children grow up believing ninjas were real in exactly the way the screen taught them. The myth insists ninjas were elite warriors, chosen at birth, raised in isolation, stripped of family and feeling, refined into perfect killing machines through brutal discipline and secret knowledge. It's compelling because it follows a familiar pattern: the Special Forces origin story, the chosen one structure, the promise that greatness comes from bloodline and training. We like believing extraordinary people are made somewhere far from us behind closed doors. But the real ninja clans were not born from privilege. They were born from its absence. The myth also says they mastered every weapon, swords, chains, poison, explosives, that they could kill silently with a touch, that combat was their purpose and perfection their standard. In reality, most avoided combat whenever possible. Fighting meant exposure. Exposure meant death. The best operation was the one nobody noticed. The enemy only discovered later that plans were missing, routes were mapped, supplies were ruined, without ever seeing who did it. The myth says ninjas followed a code, an ethical system adapted to shadow warfare, rules about when to kill and whom to serve. Warriors with principles just different from samurai. The truth is simpler and colder. Ninja clans followed one code: survival. They worked for whoever paid. They did what kept their communities alive. Not philosophy, not honor. Pragmatism forged under pressure. The myth says they were indoctrinated from childhood, knowledge sacred and hereditary, passed down through generations inside closed clans, that you had to be born into the right family to become one. That version erases the actual origin. Many who became ninja were refugees, survivors of destroyed clans, farmers who had lost land and protection, criminals with nowhere else to go. They weren't raised as ninjas. They became something else because every other option collapsed. Today, the ninja is a costume anyone can wear. You can buy weapons online, take ninja fitness classes, watch ninja competitions on television. The image has been commercialized until it feels universal, and that commercialization required erasing what was real, the poverty, the fear, the moral compromises, the regions where authority weakened and people built their own security however they could. Tourist sites in Iga and Kōga celebrate ninja heritage with tools, weapons, demonstrations, souvenirs. Visitors leave thinking they've touched authentic history. What they've touched is a sanitized version, a world where shadow warfare feels honorable and mysterious instead of harsh and necessary, where ninjas become heroes instead of survivors doing whatever it took to avoid being erased. The fictional ninja is stronger than the historical one because it gives us what we want: mastery, mystery, the romance of hidden power. The real ninja offers something less comfortable, a reminder that when structures fail, people adapt in ways that are neither noble nor clean, that survival can demand the loss of every principle except the will to remain. So we chose the myth, we built an industry around it, we exported it, and we buried the truth so deeply that most people don't even realize there was ever a difference, but there was. And understanding that difference means tracing where ninja actually came from, not from elite training programs, not from ancient warrior lineages, not from mystical temples, from places where protection disappeared, where governments could not reach, where ordinary people faced a choice between extinction and adaptation. The real ninja story doesn't begin with warriors. It begins with farmers who had run out of options. Where ninja actually came from, the ninja clans emerged in two specific regions of central Japan, Iga province and the Kōga district. These were not centers of power. They were the opposite, places where power had never fully arrived. Iga and Kōga were mountainous. Steep valleys, difficult terrain, poor roads, slow communication. The land wasn't fertile. There were no major cities, no ports, no resources that drew conquest. That isolation wasn't romantic. It was economic marginalization. These regions produced little tax revenue and offered little military value. The great Daimyo families had limited interest in territory that cost more to occupy than it returned. So Iga and Kōga existed in a political vacuum, claimed on maps, assigned to domains, spoken of as holdings, but rarely governed. When central authority weakens, local authority usually rises to replace it. In Iga and Kōga, it didn't. No single lord could dominate the region. No samurai clan established permanent control. What formed instead was fragmentation, dozens of small communities, autonomous in practice, responsible for their own defense, forced to invent their own methods of survival because no one was coming to protect them. The people living there were not warriors. They were farmers, rice and vegetables in narrow valleys, livestock on hillsides, villages linked by rough trails. Their lives were built around planting and harvest, not combat. But farming in abandoned territory meant constant exposure. Bandits moved freely where enforcement didn't exist. Wandering soldiers from defeated armies passed through and took what they wanted. Neighboring villages fought over water rights and boundary lines. Violence wasn't an event, it was a condition. So farmers learned to defend themselves, not as a calling, but as an obligation. They formed militias, posted guards, built crude defenses, created early warning systems. Self-defense became communal because there was no outside order to lean on. They weren't trained soldiers. They were people who worked the fields in daylight and picked up weapons when raiders appeared. Their skill was improvised, shaped by whatever kept them alive. And the population of Iga and Kōga wasn't only farmers. These mountains became a refuge for people escaping worse elsewhere. Japan's feudal period was marked by near-constant conflict between competing daimyo. Clans rose, collapsed, and vanished. When a house fell, its survivors didn't inherit peace. They inherited pursuit. Many drifted into Iga and Kōga, samurai whose lords had been defeated, retainers whose families had been erased, soldiers from the losing side of political struggles, men trained for war, stripped of status and employment. They couldn't return home. They would be executed as remnants. They couldn't easily enter new service. Their loyalty would be questioned. So they moved toward places where questions weren't asked, places where authority was thin. They brought military knowledge to communities that had only learned defense through panic and repetition, proper sword technique, tactical thinking, hard lessons from battlefields and sieges. The farming villages gained expertise they had never possessed, but they also brought desperation. They had lost honor, position, future. Men with skills designed for violence and no legitimate way to use them become dangerous, especially when hunger replaces identity. Smugglers and bandits gathered there as well. The mountain passes were ideal for illegal trade. Goods could move without checkpoints, without taxes, without records. Networks formed where enforcement couldn't reach. These weren't romantic outlaws. They were people pushed outside the legal economy because the legal economy offered them nothing. Contraband, stolen goods, predation. This was the shadow market that grows wherever the official world stops feeding people. And they brought skills the farmers and refugees didn't. Secret routes, quiet movement, avoidance, information gathering, the instinct for operating unseen. What emerged in Iga and Kōga wasn't a warrior culture. It was a survival culture. Farmers who learned violence, refugees who lost legitimacy, criminals who lived outside it. None of them chose the conditions. All of them adapted because adaptation was the only remaining option. These communities were autonomous but loosely connected. They cooperated when necessary and competed when convenient. There was no single hierarchy holding them together. Each village decided for itself. Each family protected its own. They were also isolated from mainstream society. The samurai class looked down on them as peasants and criminals. Major institutions held limited presence. Official values about hierarchy and order meant little in a place where order rarely existed. That isolation shaped them. Their methods of leadership, decision-making, and conflict resolution bent toward function, not tradition. Violence wasn't ritualized. It wasn't framed as honor. It was the removal of threats. A farmer killing someone who threatened his crops wasn't at war. He was trying to keep his children alive. Deception was normalized the same way. Samurai culture prized direct confrontation. In Iga and Kōga, direct confrontation could be a death sentence. If trickery avoided a fight, you used trickery. If sabotage worked better than battle, you chose sabotage. Shame was a luxury stable societies could afford. These were the communities that became ninja clans, not through sudden transformation, but through gradual recognition that the skills they'd built for survival had value beyond their mountains. Because while Iga and Kōga were politically marginal, they were geographically central. They sat between major domains, routes cut through the hills connecting important territories. Information flowed through these regions even when authority didn't. And the Daimyo fighting for control of Japan needed things their samurai armies couldn't provide. Intelligence on enemy plans, disruption of supplies, operations that couldn't be openly claimed. They needed people who lived outside the systems of honor and visibility that governed samurai warfare. People willing to do what was necessary and accept that it would never be respectable. People who could be denied if caught, abandoned if convenient. The communities of Iga and Kōga realized they could sell exactly that, and when they did, the ninja clans were born. Not from warrior traditions, from the absence of tradition. From regions where survival demanded creativity that stable provinces never had to develop. The question wasn't how they became ninja. The question was, what happened when desperation became a profession? Why they fought differently. The ninja clans had no armies. This wasn't strategy, it was reality. Armies require resources, weapons for hundreds, armor that takes months to produce, horses that cost fortunes to maintain, supply chains that feed men on campaign, infrastructure that keeps a force moving. The communities of Iga and Kōga had none of it. They were poor, subsistence farming, supplemented by smuggling. They couldn't equip a professional military force. They had farmers who could fight when forced to, not soldiers who fought as a living. They had no banners, no crests on flags and armor, no symbols announcing identity, lineage and pride. Banners were for clans with legitimacy, histories they wanted remembered, reputations they wanted seen. Ninja clans had nothing to advertise. Their strength came from anonymity. Their value came from deniability. A banner would have destroyed the only advantage they possessed, the ability to act without leaving a name behind. They also had no land to defend, and that separated them from samurai clans at the deepest level. Samurai warfare was about territory, castles, provinces, borders, ancestral domains. Land was wealth. Land was legitimacy. Land was why wars were fought. But the ninja clans owned almost nothing. The mountains they lived in were barely worth occupying. No castles to siege, no borders to push, no prize to take. Their poverty became a kind of shield. Few invaded because there was little to gain, so their relationship to combat was inverted. For samurai, battle was purpose, the display of valor, the fulfillment of warrior identity. Victory in open combat brought honor. Death in battle could be turned into glory. For ninja, battle was failure. It meant you'd been seen. It meant the operation had broken. It meant you were fighting to stay alive instead of completing the job. Every second spent in combat was a second closer to capture or death. So they avoided fighting whenever possible, not from cowardice, but from calculation. Even a fight you won could still be a disaster if it didn't need to happen. Combat left evidence, bodies, witnesses, trails that could be followed back to a patron or a village. Avoidance became the core strategy. If a target was too defended, you waited. If a route was too exposed, you found another. If the mission demanded open confrontation, you questioned whether it was worth attempting at all. That required a patience samurai culture didn't reward. Samurai were trained toward aggression, toward confrontation, toward visible proof. Waiting wasn't heroic. Retreat was shameful. Victory meant defeating an enemy where everyone could see it. Ninja operated by the opposite logic. Waiting was wisdom. Retreat could be success if it preserved your life. Victory was the objective completed, whether anyone recognized it or not. Information came before violence, always. A ninja spent far more time watching than striking, learning guard rotations, mapping exits, identifying weak points, judging who could be bribed and who would never bend. This was the real craft. Anyone can learn to hold a blade. Far fewer can enter hostile ground, absorb the layout, find the cracks and leave without being noticed. That took observation, memory, patience, and judgment. Violence was a last resort, used when intelligence failed or when the mission demanded removal. Even assassination, the act most associated with ninja, was rare. It drew attention. It invited investigation. Often it was safer to sabotage supplies or spread disinformation than to leave a corpse behind. When violence was necessary, it wasn't ceremonial, no ritual, no code of fairness, no concern for equal combat. If poison was easier than steel, use poison. If fire was safer than entry, use fire. If distance reduced risk, kill from distance. Samurai found this contemptible. They fought face to face. They announced themselves. They gave opponents a chance to prepare. Combat followed a set of understood rules, what separated war from murder. But ninja couldn't afford rules like that. They were outnumbered, out-equipped, and legally unprotected. If they fought clean, they died. So they fought to survive. And survival meant using every advantage available, whether it earned respect or not. Escape mattered more than victory. A ninja who completed a mission and returned alive was successful. A ninja who completed a mission but died in the process had failed, because a dead operative can't report what he saw, can't work again, can't feed anyone who depended on him. That reversed samurai values entirely. For samurai, a glorious death could outweigh a shameful life. The ultimate achievement was dying in service. For ninja, the ultimate achievement was living. Survival meant you could keep providing for your family, keep earning for your community, keep using skills that took years to build. Death was waste, not triumph. So they trained to disengage, to recognize when a situation turned unwinnable and pull away before it closed. Smoke bombs weren't theater, they were cover. Exit routes weren't paranoia, they were planning. Speed mattered more than confrontation. Samurai were trained not to retreat, to hold positions regardless of cost. That produced famous last stands, celebrated in stories. It also produced famous casualty lists. Ninja retreated constantly. They abandoned missions when risk exceeded value. They withdrew from fights they might have won, but couldn't win safely. They chose survival over completion when the objective proved impossible. By samurai standards, that was humiliating. But ninja weren't competing for samurai respect. They were competing with hunger, with pursuit, with a world that offered them no legitimacy at all. Their methods worked because they did what honorable warriors would not: hide instead of announce themselves, deceive instead of challenge, run instead of stand, sacrifice glory for effectiveness. That is what made them valuable. Daimyo needed operations samurai armies couldn't perform, intelligence that couldn't be gathered formally, sabotage that couldn't be traced, problems solved while maintaining plausible deniability. Ninja provided exactly that, not because they were better warriors than samurai, but because they fought by different rules, rules built for survival, rules built for results. And they worked well enough that Japan's most powerful lords paid for their services, even as they despised what those services required. Because sometimes empires didn't need banners, they needed shadows. How the ninja system worked. The ninja clans were not assassin guilds, they were intelligence networks. Everything revolved around information, gathering it, protecting it, weaponizing it. A typical operation began with reconnaissance. Long before any action, operatives spent weeks, sometimes months, studying targets. Castles watched from distant hills, troop movements tracked along roads, conversations absorbed in markets and taverns. The surveillance was designed to be invisible. Operatives dressed as farmers, merchants, wandering monks. They asked harmless questions that revealed useful details. They learned patterns without announcing interest. They became part of the scenery and memorized everything. Information flowed back to Iga and Kōga through messenger networks. Not dramatic figures in black uniforms, ordinary travelers moving along ordinary routes. Messages hidden in false-bottomed containers, coded language that looked mundane to anyone intercepting it. Speed mattered less than security. A message that arrived late but untouched was worth more than one delivered quickly with risk attached. Information was useless if the enemy knew you had it. Scouts worked at the edges of campaigns. They moved ahead of armies, reading terrain, locating defensive positions. They slipped into camps disguised as refugees or merchants. They counted soldiers, measured morale, traced supply lines. This demanded skills samurai armies rarely practiced. Blending into civilian life, reading landscape for advantage, judging what mattered and what was noise. These weren't lessons taught through formal drills. They were habits built over years. Infiltration of cities was among the most valuable services the clans provided. Cities were information hubs, trade, communication, politics. They were also hard to penetrate, especially during war. So operatives planted themselves early, months, sometimes years before they were needed. They became servants inside important households. They opened shops near administrative buildings. They joined guilds and associations. They earned trust in plain sight and reported back the entire time. These embedded operatives delivered constant intelligence. They knew which officials were corrupt and vulnerable. They understood factional disputes behind public unity. They moved through restricted spaces without suspicion because they belonged there, legitimately. When war sharpened, these networks activated. The same people who had spent years building cover stories suddenly had tasks: steal documents, identify weak gates, locate stored supplies, map routines. Political sabotage was often more common than violence. The clans specialized in destabilizing systems without needing bodies. Rumors planted to fracture trust between officials. Forged documents designed to implicate rivals, information manipulated to ignite internal conflict. It worked because it exploited what governments feared most: betrayal from within. A rumor of rebellion could trigger investigations that paralyzed administration. A forged letter hinting at secret negotiations could shatter alliances. False intelligence about troop movements could send armies marching in the wrong direction, and it carried deniability. No ninja needed to be present when the damage unfolded. The target destabilized itself through paranoia and miscalculation. If the operation was discovered, there was often nothing physical linking it to an employer. Arson was a preferred method of material sabotage. Fire was simple, effective, and hard to trace. A single spark could become a disaster, and in cities built largely of wood, it spread with terrifying speed. A ninja could ignite the first flame and be miles away before anyone understood what was happening. Supply depots were primary targets. One night of arson could erase months of stored food and weapons. You didn't need to defeat an army in battle if you could remove its ability to fight. Infrastructure was vulnerable too. Bridges weakened, so they failed under weight. Irrigation systems damaged to create artificial drought. Roads sabotaged to slow movement. Minimal manpower. Strategic consequences. Disruption didn't always require destruction. Operatives infiltrated the merchant networks that fed armies. They bribed suppliers to deliver inferior goods, delayed shipments through bureaucratic interference, created shortages that turned campaigns into slow collapses. This economic warfare was invisible, and it was brutal. An army that couldn't eat, couldn't fight. A campaign without arrows or powder had to retreat. The clans understood what many warriors refused to face. Logistics decided outcomes as much as courage did. Psychological operations targeted morale. Stories of supernatural signs in camps, unexplained sounds at night that kept soldiers awake. Disturbing symbols left where they would be found. These tactics used superstition with intent. Soldiers who believed they were cursed fought poorly. Commanders who thought they faced something beyond human made irrational choices. Fear could be weaponized without a blade ever leaving its sheath. Assassination existed, but it was exceptional, reserved for targets who couldn't be neutralized through other means. Individuals whose removal created an advantage sabotage alone couldn't deliver. Even then, the killing was rarely the hard part. Planning was. Months spent learning routines, identifying vulnerabilities, mapping escapes. Success depended on preparation. Failure didn't just cost a life, it threatened entire networks. Methods shifted with circumstance. Poison if access to food or drink was possible. Blades if close approach could be done cleanly. Fire if distance was safer. The goal wasn't drama, it was elimination with minimal evidence. Assassinations stayed rare because they were expensive in risk. Every death drew attention. Every investigation threatened operatives who had taken years to place. The clans protected their embedded agents by using them sparingly, only for objectives that couldn't be replaced. Intelligence remained the primary weapon. Combat, infiltration, sabotage, all of it existed to serve one purpose: knowing what an enemy would do before the enemy could do it. That made the ninja system different from any other force in Japan. Samurai competed through visible power. The ninja clans competed through unseen knowledge. One destroyed enemies in battle. The other made battle unnecessary by weakening enemies beforehand. The system worked because it was decentralized. No single figure controlled everything. Each clan operated independently. Each family maintained its own networks. No single capture could unravel the whole structure. It also meant competition. Clans sold services to rival Daimyo at the same time. Operatives could be in the same city gathering intelligence for opposing sides. This wasn't betrayal. It was business. Loyalty belonged to family and community, not to temporary employers. That disturbed samurai sensibilities. Samurai served one lord with absolute allegiance. Ninja served whoever paid and moved on when contracts ended. But for communities with no land, No legitimacy, no protection. Permanence was a luxury. The question for Japan's great powers was simple. Could you win wars without ninja support? Probably. Could you win them faster, with fewer losses, fewer risks, fewer uncertainties, by buying the shadows? Absolutely. And in an era where efficiency meant survival, the networks of Iga and Kōga became something dangerous. Not a legend, but infrastructure, built beneath a civilization that insisted it fought with honor. Why Daimyo needed them? The great Daimyo of feudal Japan commanded armies of thousands. They controlled vast territories. They had samurai retainers bound by oaths of absolute loyalty. They possessed every visible symbol of power, but they were blind. Feudal power had limits built into it. A daimyo could see what happened inside his own domain, who paid taxes, which samurai served him, which roads linked his castles. His authority was visible, counted, recorded. Beyond his borders, that clarity ended. Enemy territory was sealed. Rival daimyo guarded information as fiercely as they guarded land. Send an official envoy, and you revealed your interest. Move troops, and you declared intent. Every visible action was noticed, measured, interpreted. This created a strategic blindness that slowed decision-making and multiplied risk. You couldn't attack without knowing enemy strength. You couldn't defend without understanding enemy plans. You couldn't negotiate from strength without learning where your rival was weak. Samurai armies were built for visible war, for open battles where banners flew and honor was performed. A samurai could not slip into an enemy castle disguised as a servant. A samurai army could not gather intelligence without announcing itself. The entire system ran on formality, challenges issued publicly, battles fought in recognizable patterns, conduct shaped by codes both sides claimed to respect. It made warfare legible, but it also made it informationally thin. Ninja clans offered what samurai culture could not: invisibility, the ability to move inside enemy territory without detection, to extract knowledge no formal channel could access, to act without leaving an official signature behind. They became an invisible extension of state power, a shadow apparatus that allowed daimyo to see past borders and reach past rules. Not openly, not officially, but consistently. The hiring was designed to leave no trail. No daimyo publicly contracted with ninja clans. No documents recorded payments. No letters named them. Everything moved through intermediaries. Coded language and face-to-face arrangements meant to vanish as soon as they were spoken. A daimyo might send a trusted retainer to meet representatives from Iga or Kōga in neutral territory. Terms discussed verbally. Payment delivered in untraceable goods rather than recorded coin. The entire transaction existed outside the world of official records. That was the point. If an operation succeeded, the daimyo benefited without being tied to it. If it failed, he could deny involvement. The ninja absorbed the risk, while the employer kept plausible deniability intact. These were temporary alliances, not sworn bonds. A clan might work for one lord in spring and a rival in autumn. Loyalty lasted only as long as the contract. When the contract ended, so did the obligation. To samurai culture, this was revolting. Samurai served one lord for life. Changing sides was dishonor, but ninja clans couldn't afford permanence. They had no ancestral domains to defend, no hereditary position inside the hierarchy. Their survival depended on remaining useful to whoever needed them next. Daimyo accepted it because they had no alternative. You couldn't demand samurai loyalty from people who weren't samurai. You couldn't expect lifelong service from communities with no legal place in the system. You hired them the way you hired any contractor, for specific tasks, for limited time, with the understanding that the relationship was transactional, and that made them expendable in a way samurai were not. A daimyo who lost samurai retainers lost political capital. Those families had status, history, connections. Their deaths created obligations, revenge, compensation, remembrance. A ninja who died on an operation left no monument behind, no ceremony, no official record acknowledging he had existed. He was a tool that broke in use, regrettable, replaceable. The clans expected losses and priced the risk into their work. That expendability was part of why Daimyo relied on them. Ninja were sent to do what was too dangerous or too dishonorable for retainers with political value. If someone had to die, better a shadow than a name with a lineage. If the work violated codes, better someone already outside those codes. Daimyo used ninja to solve problems that could not be solved honorably. Sabotage without declaring war. Intelligence without revealing interest, destabilization without fingerprints, sometimes elimination when other methods failed. A shadow economy of warfare formed alongside the visible one. On the surface, Daimyo fought through samurai armies with public honor. Under the surface, they fought through ninja networks with private pragmatism. War was becoming informational. Battles still mattered. Territory still shifted through force. But more and more, battles were decided before the first clash, through intelligence that exposed weakness, sabotage that crippled supplies, psychological pressure that hollowed morale. Ninja clans specialized in that pre-battle war. They didn't replace armies. They made armies effective by ensuring the enemy arrived weakened, misled, exhausted, or starving. A daimyo with superior intelligence could maneuver around strength and strike at vulnerability. He could negotiate while his rival guessed. He could act while the other side operated on incomplete or false information. That advantage was decisive. Two armies of equal size could produce opposite outcomes depending on who saw more clearly. The side that knew more won. The side operating blind lost. Ninja clans created the difference, but dependence carried a cost. Every daimyo who hired them admitted silently that honor alone could not win wars, that samurai values were insufficient for political survival. That power required methods their culture officially condemned. Publicly, daimyo praised martial virtue and loyal service. They built legitimacy on codes, hierarchy, principle. Privately, they paid for poison, for arson, for disinformation. They relied on people they despised, using tools they refused to acknowledge. And everyone knew it. The contradiction was obvious, but it couldn't be spoken without weakening the entire ideological foundation of feudal authority. So it stayed officially invisible, a truth understood everywhere, named nowhere. Ninja clans lived inside that gap between denial and necessity, essential and dishonorable, relied upon and reviled, employed constantly, recognized never. That liminal position gave them leverage, despite their lack of status. If one daimyo became difficult, rivals would pay. If one contract ended badly, another war would begin. Their loyalty belonged to survival, and war guaranteed demand. The great lords of Japan had created a dependency they couldn't escape. They built a system where honorable warfare wasn't enough and shadow work became mandatory, provided by autonomous clans from marginalized regions who owed them nothing. The question wasn't whether daimyo would keep using them. They had no choice. The question was, what happened when Japan no longer needed constant war, when central power ended the competition between domains? When that day came, the ninja would lose their leverage, and the shadow economy would be forced to adapt or disappear. When the state no longer needed shadows, the end began in 1600. At Sekigahara, Japan tipped into a new shape under Tokugawa Ieyasu. For the first time in centuries, one authority could claim the country as a whole. The age of competing daimyo began to close. The age of centralized power started to harden. That shift dismantled the conditions that had made ninja clans valuable. Their economy had depended on division, on domains watching one another, on lords needing intelligence they could not officially obtain, on war creating a steady demand for work that samurai armies could not perform. But a unified Japan had fewer rival borders to peer across, fewer enemy territories to infiltrate, fewer competing powers to sabotage. The market for shadows collapsed with shocking speed. The Tokugawa shogunate built what the warring Daimyo never sustained: a permanent intelligence system. Official networks of informants and investigators spread across the country, backed by authority rather than contracts. The shogunate created the metsuke, inspectors who moved through Japan watching local officials. It established the onmitsu, covert agents checking for disloyalty inside domains. Surveillance stopped being a mercenary service and became an institution. It was more efficient than hiring ninja clans. Official agents had legal power. They could demand cooperation and punish resistance. They didn't need payment permission. They served continuously as part of the state itself, and they were controllable. The shogunate didn't fear official agents selling information to rivals because there were no rivals that mattered. It didn't require plausible deniability because its authority was the law. It didn't need invisibility to operate because it could operate openly. In that world, ninja clans had no place. Their autonomy, once their greatest asset, became a threat. Any independent group capable of gathering intelligence and acting without permission was incompatible with centralized rule, so the shogunate moved to erase autonomous power systematically. Gray zones were absorbed. Regions like Iga and Kōga, which had lived in political ambiguity, were pulled fully into administration. That meant taxation, census records, land surveys, legal codes. The mechanisms of control that had never fully reached those mountains now arrived deliberately, and they stayed. The vacuum that had allowed the clans to breathe was filled on purpose. Some were absorbed. The shogunate understood these people possessed useful skills. Individuals were taken in as guards, investigators, specialists inside official security structures. But this wasn't employment of clans. It was recruitment of people who had to abandon community identity and serve the state. Their knowledge was extracted, standardized, and folded into bureaucracy. Methods that had been lived became something that could be documented, taught, controlled. That absorption hollowed out what had made the ninja system distinctive. They had been autonomous, flexible, temporary, denied and deniable. Now they were functionaries, serving one permanent master, following orders, stripped of the very independence that once made them valuable. Others resisted. They tried to maintain autonomy, to keep offering services the way they always had. But there were no buyers. The domains that might have hired them were now subordinate to the shogunate. Any daimyo caught employing an independent intelligence network risked being treated as a man preparing rebellion. The shogunate made this explicit through law. Unauthorized military training was forbidden. Private intelligence gathering was prohibited. The methods the clans had used for generations were reclassified, not as work, but as crime. And those laws were enforced. Communities in Iga and Kōga were watched. Suspected networks were investigated. Individuals accused of maintaining old practices were arrested and interrogated. The message was simple: adapt or be broken. Some attempted to transition into legitimate lives. Farmers became only farmers. Smugglers tried to become merchants. Families folded themselves into normal social structures and let the old networks die. But integration wasn't clean. Ninja communities had carried stigma for generations. Mainstream society saw them as outcasts, criminals, people built from dishonorable work. Even when they tried to live openly, suspicion followed them. Their past made full acceptance difficult, sometimes impossible. Others chose disappearance over assimilation. They moved to cities where anonymity could swallow history. They took ordinary jobs, built ordinary families. Their children grew up without names for what their parents had been. Within a generation, identity itself was erased, and the skills that had once kept them alive lost relevance. In a peaceful, centralized Japan, infiltration had no market. Sabotage had no buyers. Assassination knowledge had no legitimate place. The illegal uses were too dangerous to attempt. The risk outweighed the reward, so the networks dissolved. Without operations, there was no reason to maintain messenger chains. Without purpose, ties between families weakened. The infrastructure didn't need to be smashed. It simply stopped functioning. By the mid-17th century, ninja clans as distinct entities were effectively gone. Some individuals retained knowledge, a few retained habits, but the organized communities, the autonomous networks, the alternative structures vanished. The real ninja didn't end in a final battle. They weren't wiped out in a dramatic purge. They were rendered obsolete by history, and what remained was grim. People carrying dangerous knowledge with no safe way to use it. Specialists in infiltration and sabotage, living in a society that now criminalized those abilities. Some took the knowledge to their graves, refusing to teach children skills that would only bring trouble. Others passed down modified versions, self-defense stripped of infiltration, survival reframed as general wisdom rather than operational training. The shogunate didn't need to hunt every former ninja. Time did that work. Each peaceful generation moved further from the necessity that once shaped them. The knowledge became memory, then rumor, then curiosity. By the early 18th century, those who had actually worked as ninja were elderly or dead. Their children might have heard stories without understanding. Their grandchildren knew nothing at all. Transmission broke. Continuity ended. Japan achieved what no campaign could accomplish. It eliminated ninja clans by eliminating the conditions that created them, by building a state strong enough that shadows were unnecessary, and making independent shadow power incompatible with order. The real ninja disappeared into history, not heroically, not loudly, quietly, completely. And in the silence they left behind, something else began to take shape, something that would outlive every living clan. The myth was about to be born. How the myth was born. The transformation began on a stage, in the kabuki theaters of Edo period Japan, where entertainment replaced memory and spectacle swallowed truth. Kabuki needed villains, antagonists who could threaten heroes in ways that felt dangerous and visually thrilling. Samurai made poor villains because samurai were the audience. You didn't turn the warrior class into monsters without risking offense, but ninja were perfect. They were already stigmatized, already linked to dishonorable methods, already outside the social order theater had to flatter. And most importantly, the audience had never seen real ninja. They were working with rumor, not evidence. So playwrights invented freely. Ninja characters who moved like ghosts, who performed impossible acrobatics, who appeared and vanished through stage tricks, who threw weapons with supernatural precision, abilities that ignored physics because the story demanded it. The black costume was born there, on stage, not in history. Kabuki used stagehands dressed entirely in black to move props and change scenery. The audience understood these figures were invisible inside the story world. Technical apparatus, not characters. Then someone realized the trick could be reversed. A stagehand could suddenly become part of the plot, turn from unseen labor to revealed threat in a single motion. The moment was electrifying. It was theatrical genius. It was also entirely fabricated. Real ninja dressed to disappear into ordinary life. Farmers, merchants, servants, monks, whoever the day required. A distinctive uniform would have destroyed the point, but the black costume was dramatic, readable, unforgettable, so it stuck. And once the image existed, it began to harden into expectation. Performances grew more elaborate. Ninja gained supernatural traits, walking on water, scaling sheer walls, vanishing without a trace, manipulating minds through mystical technique. Each show pushed further, trying to outdo the last, with feats that reality could never support. Audiences loved it. Ninja became stock characters, mysterious villains with powers beyond ordinary people, perfect foils for heroic samurai protagonists, entertainment that delivered excitement without needing accuracy. Edo period popular literature followed. Novels placed ninja at the center of their plots. Writers who had never met real operatives built entire worlds from imagination. Secret methods, ancient techniques, mystical philosophies. Fictional clans multiplied. Iga and Kōga were given detailed histories that didn't match reality. They were portrayed as ancient warrior lineages, instead of communities forged by poverty and abandonment. And with each generation, the romanticization intensified. Early stories kept ninjas skilled but mortal. Later works pushed them toward the supernatural. Eventually, they became almost magical, beings beyond human limitation. The farther Japan moved from the period when ninja had actually existed as a functional system, the easier it became to replace memory with embellishment. Reality didn't vanish in one act. It was buried under layers of fiction until it couldn't be reached. Supernatural exaggeration became central. Ninja were said to control elements, summon animals, read minds, predict outcomes. Stories borrowed from other traditions, martial legends, mystical motifs, and pinned them to ninja without historical basis. Training regimens were invented to justify the miracle. Children supposedly raised from birth in isolated mountain compounds. Brutal conditioning. Secret techniques passed through master lines. The chosen from childhood narrative that always sells. None of it reflected the real origin. Poverty isn't romantic. Marginalization doesn't build adventure fantasies, so fiction replaced it with a cleaner, more satisfying structure. Secret societies appeared on the page, elaborate hierarchies, hidden villages, assassin networks guided by complex codes. Entertainment dressed itself as tradition, and over time, people treated it that way. Popular fiction was read like documentation. The line between story and history blurred, then disappeared. Then came the Meiji Restoration and Western contact. Western audiences encountered ninja through the version already reshaped by theater and literature. They had no context to separate invention from record. They inherited the myth, fully formed. Western writers amplified it again, layering their own assumptions on top. Ninja became mystical martial masters, symbols of an exotic East that seemed both fascinating and threatening. Early books repeated fictional narratives as fact. Travelers returned with accounts of ninja traditions that existed only in entertainment, and those accounts were published as authentic reporting. The myth gained credibility it never earned. The 20th century accelerated everything. Ninja entered Western fiction and film, and each portrayal added new inventions. Hollywood didn't just repeat the kabuki image, it intensified it. The exaggeration became exponential. Japanese culture industries saw the commercial potential and began producing ninja content tailored for export. Stories shaped to match Western expectation more than historical record. The myth wasn't just spreading, it was being manufactured. Martial arts schools claimed to teach authentic ninja techniques, many founded in the 20th century, selling ancient traditions that were only decades old. Students believed they were learning history, they were learning performance. Tourism followed the same logic. Sites in Iga and Kōga turned mythology into product. Museums, demonstrations, training experiences. The displays favored what people expected. Tools and weapons that fit the fantasy, techniques built for spectacle, origin stories born from playwrights, and the cycle closed. Kabuki invented an image for the stage. Literature expanded it into a world. Western fascination exported it and reinforced it. Commercial interests institutionalized it through schools and tourism, and in the process, the real ninja were erased, not simply obscured, replaced. By the late 20th century, the word ninja no longer pointed to a historical reality. It summoned entertainment, black-clad assassins, supernatural abilities, secret clans, profitable, recognizable, global, a fantasy more culturally powerful than the people it claimed to represent. So the question stopped being what ninja really were. The question became something darker, why the fantasy proved so much easier to love than the truth. Why the myth won? The myth won because it was better entertainment. That simple, that brutal, The real story couldn't compete with the fantasy on commercial terms. Entertainment rewards simplicity, clear heroes and villains, spectacular action, motivations you can grasp in seconds. The real ninja story offered none of that. It was complicated, morally compromised, built from poverty, displacement, and survival. Not the kind of material that turns easily into crowd-pleasing legend. The fantasy ninja, meanwhile, was engineered for spectacle. Mysterious warriors with impossible abilities, dramatic black costumes, exotic weapons, superhuman combat. A character designed to be instantly understood and instantly exciting. And once audiences responded, industries moved. Studios produced ninja films in volume. Television packaged ninja into recurring formulas. Publishers commissioned comics and novels. The entertainment machine recognized profitable intellectual property and developed it relentlessly. Merchandising followed. Action figures, costumes, posters, plastic weapons, video game characters. Ninja became a label that could be stamped on almost anything and sold. But merchandising demands standardization. The image has to be readable at a glance, across every country, every screen, every shelf. So the fantasy version hardened into canon. Black suit, shuriken, acrobatics, silent killing, repeated everywhere until it stopped feeling like an interpretation and started feeling like definition. Children grew up inside that definition. Ninja toys, ninja cartoons, ninja costumes, an entire understanding built from commercial entertainment, not historical education. And why would anyone chase accuracy when the fantasy was more satisfying? Real ninja, poor farmers and refugees forced into intelligence work. Fantasy ninja, elite warriors with mystical power. The choice was never equal. Manga and anime amplified the myth further. Global audiences encountered ninja through Japanese entertainment and assumed it carried cultural authority. What they received was fantasy sharpened into something even more extreme. Supernatural techniques, magical weapons, powers untethered from history. Cinema made it look real. Wirework, special effects, CGI. Each technological leap made impossible feats feel convincing. The more convincing the illusion became, the less room remained for the quiet truth. Ninja turned into a brand, not a historical category, a marketing concept. A studio could greenlight a project simply by adding ninja to the pitch. A publisher could sell by putting ninja in the title. The brand carried predictable features: mysterious, deadly, acrobatic, black-clad. Anything outside that template became not ninja, even if it was closer to reality, and the brand erased nuance. The differences between Iga and Kōga blurred into one silhouette. The reality of intelligence work collapsed into the glamour of assassination. Context, political abandonment, economic marginalization was stripped away because context slows stories down. Context complicates the product. The shadow warrior archetype replaced real people entirely. Ninja stopped being historical actors tied to a specific time and place. They became timeless figures that could be inserted into any setting, any era, any genre. That flexibility made them endlessly reusable and therefore endlessly profitable. To make that work, the suffering had to be removed. The real ninja came from desperation, from communities with no protection and no status. That origin is uncomfortable. It makes the story tragic, not aspirational. It demands moral ambiguity. It turns admiration into unease. So the myth rewrote the motive. Fantasy ninja chose the path, trained willingly, embraced the role, became elite through selection, not survival. That shift turned them from warning into wish, heroes instead of remnants. The myth became stronger than truth because it served purposes truth could not. It entertained, it merchandised, it produced icons people could admire and imitate. It offered fantasies of power and invisibility. Truth offered something else. That ninja were products of political failure and economic exclusion. That their skills formed from necessity, not sacred lineage. That their work was mostly watching, listening, disrupting, not dramatic killing. That they disappeared quietly through obsolescence. Those facts matter to history. They don't sell easily. Educational institutions couldn't compete with entertainment scale. A documentary reaches thousands. A blockbuster reaches millions. A careful book sells modestly. A video game sells millions of copies. The imbalance is structural, and once the myth dominated culture, it began feeding itself. New ninja movies referenced older movies, not records. Games borrowed from games. Comics built on comics. Each iteration moved further from history, not closer. The myth became its own source. People who tried to correct it met resistance. Real ninja were labeled boring. Historically grounded scripts were deemed unmarketable. Anything that contradicted the established image was rejected, not because it was false, but because it threatened a product people already wanted. Tourism completed the loop. Sites in Iga and Kōga could have preserved memory. Instead, they often reinforced fantasy, because tourists arrived wanting the black costumes and throwing stars, the acrobatic demonstrations, the experience they'd already bought in their imagination. Accuracy would have felt like disappointment, so the attractions gave them what they came for. Every incentive pointed one way. Entertainment made money, merchandising made money, tourism made money. Historical accuracy didn't. Commercial pressure didn't merely prefer the myth, it required it. And the myth was beautiful in ways the truth wasn't. It offered excitement, mystery, power, a clean narrative you could wear like a costume. The truth offered complexity, ambiguity, the uncomfortable weight of survival under collapse. The real ninja lost because their story wasn't designed for markets. Too morally grey for toys, too quiet for action cinema, too rooted in specific conditions for universal fantasy. It was history, compelling, but resistant to simplification. The fantasy ninja won because it was built to win. Accessible, spectacular, endlessly adaptable. A perfect entertainment product. And in modern culture, entertainment products defeat historical reality almost every time. The question isn't whether that's right or wrong. The question is, what happens when millions of people learn myths as history, and whether the damage stops with ninjas or spreads to everything we think we know about the past. The ninja clans were never elite warriors. They were what remained of broken families, of collapsed provinces, of people who could not afford honor. They didn't master war. They adapted to it. And when Japan no longer needed survivors, it kept only the myth. If you want history beyond legends and costumes, subscribe to Fragments of History. Because real history is not built on fantasy. It is built on what people had to become to live.